Okay, so let's get started with this. I think it's 11 a.m. in the UK. It's 8 p.m. where I am in Australia, but we're going to talk about from Source Lake to OneLake. So I'll just give a brief bit of introduction about myself. My name's Martin. So I am a data platform MVP. I've had that honor for about 10 years or so. Started off with SQL Server. So I came into the SQL Server space about the turn of the century, so to speak, 2000, 2002, that sort of thing. Stayed there as a DBA for quite a number of years and then kind of moved into the Azure landscape, I don't know, maybe 9, 10 years ago. And I've been playing with Microsoft Fabric since it was in private preview since basically late 22, I think it was. So that's my background. Don't know everything about Fabric, but I've been playing with it quite a lot. I've built quite a few proof of concepts and I built quite a few production systems. And what this is all about is basically moving data into Fabric. So I'll start by just giving a brief introduction. Pretty sure, we've got a bit of a varied audience. There'll be people who maybe you don't know much about Fabric, people who know various ways to move data in and out of Fabric, and people who've been playing with it for maybe a long time. So I'll just give a very brief intro. I won't really dwell on that too much, and then I'll talk about just getting data into OneLake, which is essentially the meat of the presentation. And there's a number of ways to get the data into the Fabric. Some of them are going to be really obvious. Some are going to be things that people use all the time. Some may be surprising. Some that people have overlooked. And depending on where you are, it could be any one of those things. So we'll have a look at that. And that's basically, I think I've got about 10 of them lined up. Okay, but I guess you get data in the Fabric a number of ways. You can use those ways to do transformations, get data to visualization, that sort of thing. So, it's not just about getting data in, it's about other things as well. So hopefully you take whatever you take from it, hopefully you get out some good things. So what we're going to talk about, the data journey from source data to visualization. And we've been doing this for quite a long time, even in Excel, I think back maybe 20 years ago, you're just pulling data from, I don't know, maybe your file system, bringing it into your columns and your cells and all that. And then, we moved on to Power BI. Again, most people think about Power BI as just data visualization, fancy charts, fancy pie charts, whatever it is. That's what people think about when they think about Power BI. But we still got to pull data in from somewhere. And obviously that had Power Query. And that's probably one of the things we're going to touch on at some stage tonight in our discussions. And then we had Azure Synapse. So Azure Synapse, a little bit of a crossover there with Azure itself. So some of the tools we could use in Azure, like Azure Data Factory, to move data from source, wherever that source was. Maybe it was a different cloud source. Maybe it was a source on a local computer. Maybe we needed a gateway to do it. But wherever it was, we could probably move the data from, get a connector, connect to the different source and move it into our data lake. And that would be Azure Storage. And although Azure Storage itself isn't really on the face of it, a component of Fabric, we'll see that, we can still kind of use it and essentially it's there, but probably maybe a bit transparent to what we're looking at in a minute. And then we got Microsoft Fabric. So obviously that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to be talking about getting data from A to B. So the basically story's been the same throughout the last 20, 25, but even 40 years. We're getting data from our left-hand side, from wherever it is. Let's say it's, I don't know, in an Oracle database. We're moving it across to the storage layer, which might have been Azure Storage, or might be now OneLake. Then we're doing some transformations with it. And so the way you get data in and the tools you might use to transform the data, maybe do data engineering or data science, essentially very, very similar. In fact, you could use exactly the same tools to do the data engineering as you could to do the data ingestion. So really, I kind of think about it as two main pipelines of data movement, so to speak. We've got ingestion, which obviously moves the data from source to storage. And the pattern we tend to use at the minute is extract, load, and then transform. So the extract and the load is what we're talking about. Whereas previously we might have done the extraction and the transformation all in one go. And obviously we could still do that. I guess the benefit that the extracting and the loading gives us is we're basically not touching the source system as heavily as we can. We've got the lightest touch possible. We're just saying, you know, maybe we've got a table in our Oracle database. Give me all the data from your table, put it on our storage, end of story. And then when we want to transform it, we no longer have to touch the source system, leave the source system where it is, and just do our data engineering, transformations, whatever. And then obviously when we've done the transformation stage, so that's the data transformation pipeline. So we had the data ingestion pipeline, brought the data across, all good, all finished. Then we got the data transformation pipeline. And, you know, we can do whatever transformations we want to there, make our data warehouse or star schema, Kimball model, whatever we want really. Then we can visualize it, and that's really our business intelligence. So we're not really going to talk too much about visualization, although OneLake itself does give us some sort of ability to interact with Power BI itself and do transformations there. So we will kind of touch on that, but it's obviously not the core content. So the core content is basically the ingestion pipeline. The secondary content is maybe the transformation pipeline. And then we'll touch a little bit on the visualization part, but not massively a big deal there. So today you see ingestion, storage, visualization. So obviously, I think probably most people have seen this before. And now we've got the, we've got the data storage layer there, which is OneLake, which is what we're going to be talking about here quite a lot. That's where we want to mainly drop our data. And obviously we can see the different, what do you call, experiences above. And some of those are data stores, and some of those are just like ways of moving the data into or out of any of them stores. For example, we've got the data warehouse. That's clearly a database. We've got our real-time analytics. That's kind of a mishmash of the two. It's got ways of getting data in and then ways of storing it specifically for real time. And we've heard Brian talk previously about all the features there. So I won't be going there. I'll be mentioning it. Certainly, we've got a slide on that, but I won't be going into this in too big a detail. And then we got business intelligence, which is obviously the visualization part of it. So nothing really too much to do with moving data around there, just obviously moving it for visualization purposes. But then on the other side, we've got data ingestion, which is purely about moving data from source system to OneLake. But it's not the only way that we can achieve our ETL or ELT or whatever you want to call it. So essentially, OneLake underpins everything, and we need to talk to it in some way, even though it might be transparent to what we've got. So I come up with, a list of basically ways to move data. I'll give you a little background about this talk in general. So I started off doing a talk called like OneLake Versatile Storage for Microsoft Fabric. And it talked all about the pros and cons of OneLake, and it's kind of interesting, but maybe a little bit basic. And then I've expanded it a little bit in different guises, and eventually landed here where I'll just go through some of these. Obviously, they're all grayed out at the minute for a purpose, because we haven't talked about them yet, and we will talk about them in a bit more depth as we go forward. But you know, really, data ingestion, there's, I guess, three main types of it. Like there's sort of one-time ingestion, where all we need to do is ingest the data once, and that's it, really. And to be honest, we don't really do that, do we? We want a constant flow of data coming into our systems, whether that's, you know, daily, hourly, whatever. And that's more of an incremental ingestion. So we might do one-time ingestion over and over and over again. So one day we'll ingest everything, next day we'll ingest everything again, then we'll overwrite everything, you know, and it's kind of might be okay, might be a bit too expensive. But maybe what we want is incremental ingestion, where maybe we do a full load on day one, and then day two we look what's changed, we ingest that only. Day three, we see what's changed again, we ingest that only, and so on and so forth. So they're really the two main types of what we call batch data. So we've got data sitting somewhere in a fairly static environment, and we're just like looking at it on any sort of cadence, daily, hourly, weekly, whatever it is, and saying what's changed, what hasn't changed, bring it over accordingly. And then obviously we've got continuous ingestion, not continuous into completely different, continuous ingestion, where, you know, Brian talked about that with KQL and pipelines, real-time analytics and all that type of thing. And that's kind of wasn't really too, there wasn't a lot of people doing it, let's say. We do it occasionally, but batch data was like, I don't know, I would say 80%, 90% the norm. You'd see occasionally people doing real-time ingestion, or I would anyway. But now I'm seeing more and more of that, like utility companies. I live in Australia, so a lot of mining companies tend to do it. And I think it's becoming more and more common. It's not massively, but it is definitely becoming more and more common. So we'll touch on that as we go forward. But OneLake, so we need a place to store the data. So what places are available to actually store it? Well, we've got the lake house and we got the warehouse. Kind of very similar to the lake house and the warehouse. You know, you can't really modify things with SQL in the lake house, whereas you can in the warehouse. You might use a lot of Spark SQL in the lake house and a lot of T-SQL in the warehouse. We've got the event house. Again, Brian talked about that. Where we might land real-time analytics. And as that data is coming in, we might want to look at it, see what's changed, what alerting we might need to do, things like that. And I guess as an honorable mention, I'll say is we've got SQL. So now we've got Fabric on SQL. So it's basically just SQL as your SQL inside Fabric. So, you know, but it gives us extra alternatives to maybe use that as a source for transformations or visualizations. So where do we put it and what do we need to do that? And what we need is a workspace, obviously. So everything revolves around a workspace. And how do we plan a workspace? Well, for a workspace, we need the capacity. Now, might seem a bit obvious to everyone listening to this, but you know, if we pull data in, obviously we can't pull data in, whatever method we're using, without a capacity behind our workspace. And even if we've got the capacity working and we pull data in and the data is now at rest on our lake house or our warehouse or whatever it is, if our capacity is paused, because we can pause capacities, obviously maybe to save cost or maybe we don't need it at a certain time. But when we pause the capacity, we can't get to the data. So the capacity is actually got to be on and running for us to get to the data, wherever that data might be stored, you know, regardless of whether it's a lake house, a warehouse, whatever it is. So just thought I'd touch on that as like kind of a brief introduction to where we're going with this. But out of the 11 or 12 things I touched on previously in the list, let's go through them and have a look at those. So I guess manually might not be an obvious way to get data, or it might be a really obvious way. It's probably not something we're going to do on our day-to-day pipelines. If we've got something running in production, we definitely don't want someone coming in and getting data manually every day. But if we're doing development, which I guess we are, in order to like start that, you might not want to go to an extreme method of, writing a pipeline or pulling data in with a notebook, the things that we'll talk about later. You just might want to get data quickly, put it across, pull it into your lakehouse or your warehouse, and do something with it. So the first one we've got there is like getting data manually. And, with inside our warehouse, we've got the menu we've got there. We can get data, we can upload files, we can obviously do other things from that menu. And we've also got our OneLake file explorer. Now, I kind of like this in a lot of ways, but I think it's kind of a bit dangerous in other ways. So in your workspace settings, you've obviously got a link, and we can see it here, the OneLake file explorer. We can just download that, and it works in a very similar way to how OneDrive does. So if you're familiar with OneDrive, which comes now with Windows by default, you obviously hook up to the cloud, to your OneDrive in the cloud, and your data syncs between OneDrive and the cloud and your computer. So when you save it on your computer, it goes up to the cloud, and vice versa. Well, you can basically do the same with your data in OneLake File Explorer. And it's a really good way of, say, you want to get a CSV file up there really quickly. You just drop it into your folder on your desktop, and you can free up space, move it like quickly, but it'll sync quite quickly anyway. And so that is like a really good way to do it in development. Wouldn't obviously use that in production, regardless of any kind of constraints you might have on you from your company regarding, data sovereignty or, whatever it is. Obviously, you don't want a lot of data coming down to your drives. Great for development, probably not something you're going to want to use in production. But we also got our tried and trusty Azure Storage Explorer. So for anyone who doesn't know, Storage Explorer is just a piece of software we can download, and we can connect to our Azure, or in this case Fabric, in various different ways. So for those not really familiar with lake houses and that, but they're really just like containers. So storage containers under the covers, totally transparent to where you are. That they've got the same kind of storage capacity as Azure Data Lake, so ADLS Gen 2. So we can still use Azure Storage Explorer to pull data up and also pull data down. And again, these methods are kind of great for development. Probably not something you're going to want to use in production or UAT, but if you're developing along, they are really great to use. So what's another one we could use? We could do data engineering, and that uses kind of notebooks. So what is a notebook? So it's basically just a way of writing code to get data from wherever. Now, I wouldn't say I use notebooks a lot. Well, I do use notebooks a lot, but not to get data. So when would I use them to actually get data itself? Come across a few situations where I actually want users to be able to just maybe put a file in a particular place, and then I'll grab that file and do some sort of transformation or ingestion with it. I guess maybe something that I could explain easily might be, an Excel file. A user might edit an Excel file. They might upload it weekly. I might want to grab it, just look at the rows and columns, maybe strip out a header, do something with it programmatically. And a notebook's actually great for doing that. There are other ways of doing it. We could use a data flow, which we'll come to later. But notebooks are pretty useful. I would say notebooks are probably more useful to transform data. So tend to use notebooks a lot to transform data, maybe rather than ingest data. But we can get data with them, prepare data, we can analyze, we can train data. Again, that might be quite useful for people doing machine learning and just basically programming, transforming the data as part of their transformation pipeline. So not just one thing here, and probably two things really. So we've got data integration, and we've also got um, data integration would be pipelines, so similar to ADF, but we've also got basically Power Query Online, which is data flow Gen 2. So people probably might have seen, Data Factory before. So it's kind of Fabric Data Factory rather than Azure Data Factory or Synapse Pipelines, which are all very, very similar things. And so by extension, this can we can reuse if we wanted to, maybe Azure Data Factory pipelines. They can be kind of mounted within sort of Fabric Data Factory itself, so we can reuse them. Now, just going off a bit on a tangent here, when we were kind of in the on-prem world, we had SQL integration services, and that would move data kind of from the source to the destination. And the destination pretty much always be SQL Server, but the source could have been anywhere. And then when people come to move to the cloud, this is kind of before Fabric, into the Azure world, there was a way to reuse those SSIS packages and run them as part of Azure Data Factory. And it was all good. You could do that, no problem. However, it was pretty expensive. So Azure Data Factory generally is pretty cheap to run. It's running for a limited amount of time, and it's cheap anyway. So compared to other services, it's not really expensive. But to run an SSIS integration runtime, which actually runs your SSIS packages, can be very, very expensive. So what we used to advise people there is to basically rewrite them. So what have you got there? You've got basically a bit of an upfront cost to redesign and rewrite the packages, to migrate the packages. But then the running costs are going to be a hell of a lot less. Conversely, I guess what you could do there is you could just run it in a SSIS integration runtime. However, you've got no upfront cost. You're not migrating the data really. Well, we got a little bit of a migration there, but not too much. But you've got a large cost going forward in terms of running the pipeline. So although you can mount data factory pipelines, I've never mounted a data factory pipeline that's got an SSIS component to it. But if you do come across that, I kind of strongly advise you to rewrite the pipeline if you can, and it'll be cheaper going forward, but maybe a bit of a cost up front. So that's enough about pipelines really, but obviously drag and drop, we can write code in there, but mostly a low code environment. And then we've got Power Query Online, which is basically data flow Gen 2. So very, very similar to Power Query inside of Power BI Desktop. We can do all the things that you'd expect to do inside Power Query. I've used this mainly when I've got Excel files. So it's a bit of a toss-up for me. If I want to ingest an Excel file, do I use Power Query or do I use a notebook? Because there's lots of libraries within Python that you can use to extract data from Excel, or look at rows and columns or cells or that sort of thing, and that's really helpful. So it's a bit of a toss-up for me, but Power Query, lots of people probably used to it coming from the Power BI world. might not be that familiar with actually programming a notebook or whatever, but you've got the options there to do different things. So that's our data integration. And what is one of the other ways we've got? So we can use what we call shortcuts. So most people have heard of shortcuts through, just shortcuts on your system, your computer. You might want to run a program, put a shortcut on your desktop, it points to the program and ultimately runs the program. Well, shortcuts here work pretty much the same way, except they're actually pointing to data that exists somewhere else. And that somewhere else could be within OneLake. So it might be the workspace that you're actually in, but it's probably unlikely to be the workspace that you're actually in. But it might be another workspace within the same system or another workspace on another tenant. But apart from that, we've got a lot of external data sources we can use here. We can use Amazon S3, so an S3 bucket, any sort of storage that's S3 compatible. We can go to Azure Storage, so storage that exists maybe in the same tenants within Azure or different tenants. We can go there. We can look at different things, different cloud storage options. We can look at Google, Google Storage, and blob storage as well. And I think there's other things coming along. I'm surprised. Well, I can think maybe in preview we can look at, well, Google is there. I think it's out of preview now. But there's always new ways of creating shortcuts coming along. So do keep your eye on this. And you can just use the data from where it is. You can cache the data as well. Not in every case, but in some cases, you can just cache the data. So if the data is not changed, then there's nothing really you need to do to go in order to go to that source. It's just cached and you can pull it back as you need it. You can create a shortcut to a table. So within a lakehouse, which is probably really common to land data, and actually you've got a file section. So you've got table section where basically tables are created, which are in the Delta Parquet format, and you can shortcut to any of them quite simply and bring them over to Delta Parquet format. Sorry, not bring them over, but shortcut to them. So you're not moving data in itself, but when you go to query that data, you're actually pointing to and querying data in the external system, whether that's like OneLake, S3, or whatever it is. But what you can also do with shortcuts is you can point to files. So within a lakehouse, there's a file section. And within that file section, you can have basically any sort of file you like. CSV, text file, you could have a video, you could have any kind of file you can possibly think of. And then you can create a shortcut to that file as well. So you're not just limited to one particular type of shortcut. Any kind of shortcut will do the same thing. So that's shortcuts, and they're remarkably quite easy to set up. If you've never set them up before, just go into Microsoft OneLake shortcut. It's quite rudimentary. You just follow the wizard through. This is like the first stage of the wizard I've got open here, but then you go to the next stage, and it's quite self-explanatory to set these up. And then we've also got mirroring. So mirroring, you probably might have heard of this if you've been using SQL Server for a long time. It's very, very similar, but don't confuse it with the mirroring that comes within SQL Server. So you can actually think of it more as a replicated copy. It's kept in sync in real time. So for example, maybe an easy one to get started talking about there is we've got a mirrored Azure SQL database right here. So you've got your Azure SQL database, or maybe a transactional database. It's changing, obviously in real time. You set up what we call a mirror to say, I've got 10 tables in my source system. I want all of those 10 tables to be mirrored, essentially replicated over to my source system, sorry, to my destination. And when something changes in the source, I want that to be reflected in the copy. And Fabric itself will just keep these in sync, like totally. We really don't have to do anything. There's a few rules around them to do with like primary keys and things like that. But if you satisfy those conditions, then all you have to do is really tick a few boxes and say, I want this table mirrored, and away it will go. Obviously, like we talked about capacity before, while your capacity is on, everything's running great. If you turn your capacity off, obviously the mirroring will stop, but it'll restart again when you restart your capacity, and everything will be all good. So obviously talked about mirroring as your SQL there, which I don't know, might be kind of an obvious one for a lot of data professionals working in the Microsoft ecosystem. But we've got a few other ones we can do there. A few other databases, transactional systems. We've got a mirrored Azure database for Postgres. Databricks is a big one as well. So another thing about Databricks here. So obviously we can look at Databricks table. We can mirror it across to our file system. We can also shortcut. So I talked about shortcuts in the previous slide. Now, remember that we can shortcut to a storage location. And one of the storage locations we can mirror from is blob storage. So Azure Data Lake Gen 2, which is the underlying file system for Azure Databricks, obviously running on Azure. We've got the same we can do in Amazon S3 and the same in Google. So you have to jump through a few hoops here to shortcut to Azure Databricks or Databricks, wherever it is, but it is kind of possible. So we've got we can mirror Cosmos DB as well. So obviously Cosmos DB, we've got a lot of different APIs in there. So SQL API, we've got Gremlin API, we've got all different types of data that we can use in there, and we can mirror that. Some of these are in preview. We can see down there we've got a mirrored SQL server. So we're mirroring a SQL server on premises, and works pretty similar to how Azure SQL does. But you're going to have to go through a gateway there on the local system. Obviously, you're going to interact through a firewall. But some of these things have been in preview for a while. We can see the Cosmos DB one is too. But they're there. They're reasonably solid. Preview features probably not to be used in production, and they obviously carry a very, very different SLA to non-preview features. So things that have gone to GA. So you always got to be careful with preview features. Things might change. They might not go GA. So don't rely on them, but do have a play with them. And we can see there Snowflake as well. So really got the three big ones now. We've got Azure, Databricks, Snowflake. So if you want data from any of those systems, then you can mirror it to your Microsoft Fabric. So where do we go now? So we've got some real-time data. So real-time, I kind of think about it as being its kind of own little ecosystem within Microsoft Fabric itself. So we obviously need a real-time source. So that's different from a batch data source. Although, there are some batch data sources that we can kind of mimic as a real-time source. And I'm thinking of things like CDC, so change data capture within SQL Server. So as your data changes, you might want to grab that and put it right over to your as an event stream. So one of the things we need to bring data across, that hopefully Brian went on about, is an event stream. So you've got to stream the data in, and we need to land that in a destination, which would very likely be our KQL database. Now, by default, the data will go to the KQL database we've set up. If we want it to also maybe go to our lakehouse, we just got to take some additional action, which is just really a checkbox to say, yeah, we want it going to our lakehouse. That's where we want to store it. And we can store it there as well. But as the data's coming in, we've got a piece in the middle where we can do transformations on the data should we need to do so, or examine the data. We might not want to do any kind of transformation at all. We might just want to examine the data. Maybe we want to know if a piece of data has moved above or below a certain threshold, or the pattern of the data is within certain limits, or making certain being available to give us certain scenarios. So it's not something that I've played with a lot. I've only worked on a few real-time systems, but I'd say they are becoming more and more common. Brian did a great job of talking about the KQL language itself and how it's pretty similar to SQL to start off with. So for someone who knows SQL quite well, they probably should have no problem transforming into basic to intermediate KQL, no problem. But then it kind of gets a bit more advanced, and there's a lot of things you can do in there that you can't actually do within SQL. And it's definitely a good language to have under your belt, and just to know what the capabilities are within that language itself. So that's real-time, one way of acquiring real-time data, which is a bit different than acquiring batch data, which all of the other scenarios that we talked about here are really dealing with. So number 7 is kind of stuck this in as a bit of an outlier. So we got semantic models. So within Power BI itself, we've obviously been able to create semantic models since, well, they were data sets, they were Power BI data sets, but now they're called semantic models. And we've been able to create them in Power BI for obviously quite some time. I think Power BI is coming up to 10 years at the moment. And you might want to take the data that exists within those semantic models and use it maybe for another purpose, maybe even as part of some sort of migration that you're doing, or maybe something else. But the point is that you can look at those semantic models and you can extract data from them and do whatever you want, put it into a lakehouse. It's probably not really going from an external source to a Fabric destination. Probably the semantic model probably already exists with Microsoft Fabric, but it could maybe exist in a different tenant or a different workspace. But so it's an option. It's an option. Not one I see used a lot. In fact, very, very rarely, but it is an option. So you just need to connect to it. An example might be using a notebook, acquiring the data and doing something with it. So let's come to the end of this and look what else we've got here. Well, we got programmatically. So we can acquire data through a number of different programming techniques. And I guess the most obvious one here is REST APIs. So, whether we're dealing with Azure, Fabric, there's a lot of REST APIs. Everything is basically accessible through JSON, REST calls, and we can acquire data, we can post data, we can get data, we can manipulate that data as it comes. And so I think whatever you're doing, even if you're not acquiring data, even if you just want to, get to know your operational details within Fabric, or want to know a setting from your Fabric environment, getting to know these REST APIs and just how to use them can be quite beneficial. But yeah, we can do a lot of stuff with that. And apart from REST APIs, there are various different APIs that we can use. C#, we've got Python APIs, we've got different kinds of APIs in different programming languages that we can use to manipulate the data there. And as an outlier, I put on here the Fabric CLI. So lots of things have got command line interfaces. and there's one now for fabric. I think it might still be in preview for the minute. I've not used it in production myself, but I've used it in development quite a lot to basically look at objects within fabric itself and do things with it. So say, I don't know if you'd really use it to ingest data, but you definitely use it to manipulate things within the workspace itself. So do have a look at that. What you have to do there, I think you just download it, you install it, and then you basically start it. You get a new prompt, a new Fabric CLI prompt, and you can manipulate different pieces of data or things from your workspace yourself and use it like that. So it basically gives you a lot of options. So between all of those APIs you've got there, you've got a lot of flexibility. You can use a lot of them from within notebooks themselves, and you've got a lot of options. Then we got SQL on Fabric. So again, put this in as a little bit of an outlier. SQL on Fabric, it's essentially an Azure SQL database within the Fabric ecosystem itself. So and one of the main reasons I mention this is because you actually get two endpoints here. And when I started playing with this, it wasn't particularly obvious to me, probably because I didn't read the documentation, which is maybe a lot of the audience fall into that category. Maybe they don't. But essentially, if you've got a Fabric SQL database, so you've got your data up to your Fabric SQL database, however you want to get it up, and there's lots of different ways to do that. Anyway, to attach to the database itself, you get a database endpoint. So the endpoint will look like something like database.whatever.fabric.com, and that will lead you to obviously your SQL database on Fabric, and you can manipulate, you can change your data, you can do whatever you like to the database itself through T-SQL like that. However, your database will automatically be mirrored to a data warehouse, and then you'll get a data warehouse endpoint. So the endpoint now will be data warehouse.whatever.fabric.com. Now that is literally a mirrored copy, and so it's kind of the same. But what's it for? So it's more for like visualization purposes. It's in the data warehouse. You can attach to that without attaching to your actual database itself. However, that's a read-only endpoint, so you can read the data from there, but you don't want to be modifying data within that endpoint itself. So the database is read and write, as you might expect, and the data warehouse is read-only. So we'll come to the last one now. We're nearly out of time. And I've just put here the warehouse, and really it's T-SQL. So there's a lot of things we can do within T-SQL to manipulate data. We've got a copy command, so we can copy data into a particular table from a storage location. The storage location, we've got a HTTP endpoint, might be Azure storage, might be some storage within our lakehouse, could be anywhere. And we've got a with clause, which tells it various properties about the data set we're trying to copy. For example, has it got a header row? Has it not got a header row? What are we doing there? We can use open row set, which is very, very similar. Again, we tell it now what format we're in, whether we're using header rows, have we got a terminator, all that sort of thing. So again, exists within T-SQL. Very similar to the copy command there as well. And we can also do CTAS, which is create table as. So we might create our table from there, and we might point at a different database where we're moving data from. But those three commands all run within T-SQL. We've got copy, open row set, and we've got SQL. So we've looked at kind of a fair few ways there of acquiring data, sort of manually to start off with, which great way for doing things in development, maybe not for useful in production. We've got data integration with notebooks we looked at. We looked at data engineering, which is pipelines, and we looked at data flow gen 2s, which is essentially Power Query. We've seen mirroring, so basically replicating data. Not the same as SQL mirroring. SQL mirroring is a bit more advanced. The term mirroring here is being used generically, kind of a replicated copy. We've got shortcuts. Remember, we can shortcut to internal storage systems, other workspaces, and we can also connect to external sources such as Azure storage. We can connect to S3, we can connect to Google. We threw in semantic models, getting data from those, and we've seen we can do programmatically collecting data from different sources and maybe ingesting it. We looked at real time, and then we've seen we can have a SQL database on Fabric. And lastly, we looked at some T-SQL commands that exist in our warehouse. The copy command, the open row set command, and the T-SQL command. And I put on there Mountain ADF that really goes within the data engineering bit in the pipelines. So I think that brings us right to time. I'll have a look at the Teams link and see if there's any questions. But if there is, feel free to shout out.